What's up? What's up? What's up? It's Monday. It's November 9th. And if it's Monday and 8 o'clock, then it must be real talk for our community with the Impact Movement. I'm delighted to see you. I know it's tight. It feels like the end of the month is here already, but it can't be because we haven't had any turkey or sweet potato pie, or in my case, some oyster dressing. But it's going to be a different year for us in light of this COVID action. So much is happening with the rise and surge of cases. A week ago from tomorrow was the election. So we got a lot going on in this world today. And tonight I'm excited because we're going to talk about loving our communities. And I want to introduce our guests. Like I said, I'm Jimmy McGee, and I'm going to invite the ladies first. First, I'm going to invite, because she's the furthest away, over near the Pacific Ocean, is Margaret Yu. She is the executive director of Epic Movement, which is a ministry of crew, but it's a ministry to Asian Americans. What's up? How you doing there, Margaret Yu? All right. And
Hi, Jimmy.
Hey, sis. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
We're going to swing all the way back to the East Coast, up in Queens, is Shanay Scott. She's part of Young Life College. What's up, Shanay? How you doing?
Hi.
All right. So she's are you an area director or you're a college minister for Young Life? College director. College director. That's what they call it. And then now since we're over there, before we go back to the West Coast, since we're over there in New York, let's bring in Orlando Crespo. There we go. He's in the Bronx. That's my dude. Don't hate on him because he's a Yankees fan. Oh, the Yankees didn't make it to the World Series, so you can pray for him. But this is my friend, Orlando Crespo. He was married 2 weeks after I was in the same year. We're not giving up tapes tonight, Orlando, when that was. But it's good to see you. How you doing, Orlando?
I'm doing well. Great to see you, Jimmy.
Good. And he's the executive director of R.S.V.P, which is a national ministry with InterVarsity that served Latino students or Latinx. Can I say Latinx, Orlando?
Sure.
All right. Around the country. And then last, but certainly not least, is a good friend of mine, Reverend Dr. Randy Woolley. He's done a lot. He's one of the founders of NATES. He's a distinguished professor at Portland Seminary, formerly known as George Fox. He's married to Edith, which I think is his greatest accomplishment. But he's I
call that my better 1/3. I mean, my better 2/3.
His better 2/3. Well, he's right about
there
that.
We go.
That's for sure.
Got that one right.
And he's got all kinds of grandkids. I think you got 4 now, right? 3 or 4? 5 grandkids. And all his kids are married. And he's also the co-founder, because I want to put Edith in this, for Elahe House. Is it the Elahe House or Farm? Which one is this one now?
Elahe Indigenous Center for Earth Justice and Elahe Farm, James 3.
And Elahe Farm. And he's in Portland or outside. No, he's not in Portland, but he's outside in Oregon. So we got 2 people on the East Coast, 2 people on the West Coast, and I'm smack dab in the middle. So for opening statement, I'd like to just ask you a question about your commitment to do ministry in your community. And I want to start with the ladies first. Margaret, talk a little bit about your commitment to reach Asian American people. Where does that come from? How important is that to you? Oh, you're on mute.
I always do this. Sorry, guys. I think it comes from my own background as an Asian American raised in the Midwest, where I didn't really like being myself. I didn't like being Asian American. And so as I got into college and as I started walking with Jesus, it became really clear to me that God really did not make a mistake in making me Asian American and a Christian. And that it became clear to me that what I was learning about my identity from non-Christian friends, that actually God has a really good story for my life and that he had a good plan to use all that I am for his glory. And because of that, I have this lifelong desire to see many Asian Americans come to embrace their identity as Asian American followers of Christ who can actually make a difference in this world in a very specific and unique way. And so just finding our place in this world and in God's redemptive mission. And so for me, it starts with my own story and where I did not really enjoy and embrace my heritage as an Asian American. And even later on as Asian American Christian, it was until later that I started walking with the Lord that I embraced that. So that's why I love my life and I love what God has done with those who surrender to Him, and that our uniqueness comes from being not just Asian American but also Christian together.
And Shanay, you're in Brooklyn, and so you're doing ministry with Young Life up there. And I don't want to presume that you do it exclusively with Black students, but I do want to talk about your passion for Black students and your love for Black students. Where did that come from? And just give us a little bit of that story.
Yeah, Jimmy, I'm actually doing ministry in the Bronx.
Uh-oh.
Yes, but my passion for Black girls in particular was about the lack of representation in my own life. There were always Black men who were the fiery Pentecostal preachers. And there was and my other friends who were young Black boys could look up to them easily and see themselves in that position. But I sat in the church until I was 18 years old, and nobody recognized my call because I was female. And so I think that was important to me. I remember coming home from church and re-preaching all the sermons in my grandma's bathroom mirror, hoping nobody would hear me because that would become a problem. And so I do it for all the little girls who are doing that, where you feel the fire shut up in your bones when nobody's affirming that because you're female. I think another thing that's important to me is not only doing it as a Black woman, but doing it as a young Black woman, because in every facet, I'll be discriminated against either because of age, gender, or race. And the age thing is also big. I'm under 30. And so I think also what Black women think you have to be, how old they think you have to be when you respond to your call. And so I think it's also important for me to show up young, Black, and female in Black and brown communities to show people that you could answer your call with the skin that the Lord gave you at the age He gave it to you at, even if your church can't affirm it because of your gender.
Well, that's spot on. In fact, as I'm listening to you, the thing that came to mind, there's a book that just came out maybe about a few months ago called Parable of a Brown Girl. Have you heard of that book? By Christy Adams, and I follow her on Twitter. And it's a phenomenal book as she tells a story of Black girls. So that's a very profound one. All right, Orlando, talk to me about your desire. I can still remember, Orlando, when you became the director of LaFay. I think you took a sabbatical before you started working, if I remember correctly. At that time, I was working with university at that time. And I remember, if I'm right, were you the first or second LaFay director? I remember Bob, who had a heart attack, but I'm not sure if he was a LaFay director, but you were, correct?
No, Bob Zapata never became the LaFay director. We did have some LaFay coordinators beforehand, two women, Jen Ball, Sarah Baz-Crippen, kind of served in an interim coordinator role, but we had never had a LaFay director until I stepped in. Dr. Sam Barkat recruited me. I was the area director in New York City. I'd been working in student ministry for about 13 years. When I began to realize that the LaFay ministry would really never take off unless there was Latino leadership to give it direction and guidance. And at the time, I was the only Latino area director. And so it kind of fell on me to begin to take some steps to give leadership and infrastructure to a ministry that was, it was just a name only, LaFay. So I've been the LaFay director now for 20 years. I've been serving within a varsity for about 33 years. I'm feeling all those years. I'm sure, Margaret, you're feeling them as well. I think you've done 35. But I love what I do. And I think for me, I began to realize my need for my own, to really explore my own ethnic journey, because I felt isolated in certain white circles. One of them was the neighborhood my parents moved to when I was about 5 years old. It was an all-white Irish Italian neighborhood. We were the first Puerto Rican family moving in, and even as a child, I felt some of the alienation there. And then also in theater, I did some summer theater, and it was an all-white summer theater group. I felt it there at Colgate University, where I studied, and I just realized that that I needed to understand my own ethnic identity and journey if I was to be able to make sense of what was going on in my life. And so I've really dedicated my life to helping young Latino people realize that that so much of making sense of this white supremacist world we live in is to understand themselves well, to be able to engage
Mm,
in issues well.
mm,
Wow. Wow. And last but certainly not least, Randy, you've been involved in an assortment of ministry to Native American people, but also you went through personal transformation too, more and more deeply entrenched and in love with Native American people. And it came out when I met you and you led us on the Trail of Tears throughout the country, a group of staff in one bus and your van following, I don't know what we did, about 1,000 miles. But Randy, talk to us about your passion to reach Native people and why that's so significant for you and for Edith. Because I know it's together. It's not just individual. It's not just you. It's you and Edith.
Yeah, Edith and I are co-sustainers of everything we do, even when she wasn't being recognized for it. Like I said, she's my better 2/3. So, so we do this all together. We have sometimes different roles, but we've done every kind of service to our indigenous people probably imaginable over the years, over 30 years. The government and the church worked hard for about 400 years to get us colonized and to cause us to begin to colonize ourselves. And so, it takes a lot to peel all that stuff back after generations and generations and generations. So we looked at what was being done in Indian country. We've done all, like I said, sobriety and houseless ministry and young unwed mothers and food pantries and clothes pantries and baby pantries and on and on and on. The feeding programs throughout the years. I pastored all of those kinds of things. The government nor the church, either one were effective in what they were trying to do, and more than not being effective, I mean, they were a miserable failure of being effective, but more than that, they were disempowering, and that's the government and the church disempowering our people. And so we just said we have to find a model that will put a halt to that and begin to help us to decolonize, to indigenize, and to get back into our relationship with the earth and relationship with our Creator. And that's what we've been about ever since we started Elahe back in, I guess that was at like 2000. That's when we first planted Elahe, and in Kentucky. And we've had 3 iterations. This is the 3rd and final that we're at right now in Yamhill, Oregon. So, but we're trying to create a holistic program, if you will. I don't know if program's the right word, but we build relationships with people. We have them come in. We have schools. They're involved in ceremony and story and getting their hands in the dirt and talking to one another and laughing and joking and eating together. And I don't know what the secret is, but they go away changed. So,
Well, I don't know if there's a secret to anything, but I know interacting with all of you guys is very important for, I think, the sustainability of life in our community. So I was going to start with COVID, but since Orlando and Randy started off, let's just get deep, a little bit deep in the water, because you both have introduced 2 terms, white supremacy and colonization. And you've talked about the struggle that you've had both externally, and Randy, you talked about it also internally. So let's just get out here and get into some of the waters right now, starting with you, Shanay. Now, when we talk about colonization and white supremacy, what's the struggle of that for Black people? What's the struggle for colonization and white supremacy for Black people in 2020 right now, what we're going through?
Wow, that's a loaded question. I would say for my generation in particular, is not internalizing it. It's not looking at white people and also deeming them supreme. And so we can clearly identify where white supremacy is impacting us and oppressing our communities. But sometimes I'm walking down a Bronx street that's being gentrified by developers that don't care about the community, and a Latina or a Black girl will say, good, them people wasn't doing nothing in front of the projects anyway. And it's like, wait a minute, because what are you saying when you really say that? And now we have to have this deeper conversation about, why do you think that gentrification is the only revitalization that our community can go through at the hands of other people?
Shut up.
Right? Like, why are we not empowered enough? Why are our kids not empowered enough to think that we could have went to community board meetings and had conversations about buildings that go up or don't go up? And I'm not sure what would have happened, but even the students that I'm talking to feel like they're waiting for a savior. So we get the white supremacy in a Christopher Columbus kind of way, but I don't think we understand how we internalize it ourselves daily, and how we sometimes wait in poor, broken communities, waiting for city bikes and Whole Foods, thinking now that means that we live in a nice place. But why is it that the place doesn't feel nice, or you don't even feel like you're empowered enough to make it nice? Because we just live here. And I promise you, there's a twinkle in the eye of kids, Gen X, Gen Z, when they see white people walking around their neighborhood. All of a sudden, the neighborhood is good and better. And that's heartbreaking to me, because that means when you see people that look like you hanging out in front of the bodega or the projects or whatever's going on, you don't deem them as good, which is also very telling about what you're thinking about yourself. And so the internalized white supremacy, the white being the supreme race, white being the only thing that can come and save us, I think is the biggest issue that I see between the generation under me and white supremacy.
Oh, wow. Now she done gave us a mouthful, Orlando. So talk to us. Oh, wait, was Randy, you were about to jump in real quick?
Well,
I just want to say,
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Sorry, Randy. I just want to say what you said was so profound, because I think that's how it hits my community as well, in terms of, I would say it as white is normative, that everything like, ooh, I want to look a certain way, my even colorism within our own communities and different things, and even Christianity, or like, oh, this is the way to do it. That's the right way, right? It's the white right way. And it's so subconscious, right? And we are so ensconced in the system, I think, too. And so I see that in my community as Asian Americans. And part of it plays off with our desire to fit in as BIPOC people. We all, we're human beings who want to belong and fit in. But that taps into our temptation to belong so badly that we would want to do it so badly that we would go, that's normative and that's good, and this is bad.
Wow.
And it leads to self-hatred sometimes. It leads to Asian Americans having, surgery on their eyes to look a certain way, or skin color, whatever it is, or the way we talk, or the way we do certain things. So I just really love what you shared, because it really resonated with my community.
Thank you.
So I was thinking,
go ahead, Randy.
Reverend Scott was sharing that before you can get the colonizer off your back, you got to get colonization out of your head. And it's deep. It's deep. It goes all the way to the Western worldview. And the Western worldview is the one who plants the foundation in which white supremacy thrives. And so there's a whole lot there that we have to, no matter who we are, Black, Indigenous, people of color, no matter who we are, we're all affected by the Western worldview. And it's that Western worldview that creates that white normalcy that Margaret was talking about.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. What about you, Orlando? Jump on in.
Yeah, I think for me, looking at it from a Puerto Rican perspective, you look at Puerto Rico, and I think it's the oldest colony ever in the history of the world, over 400 years, and so when you've been colonized that long, I remember I think we had our independence for like a day or something between the transition of Spanish rule to American kind of
Mhm.
colonialization, and so what happens psychologically is that you just the one that's oppressing you continues to convince you over years and decades of your lack of worth, and so I think of some cousins of mine who, when we've talked about independence, can't fathom the idea that Puerto Rico could ever exist without the help of the United States. It's just unthinkable for them because they've bought into even the colonized mindset of the oppressor and their view of the oppressed person. And so Pablo Fieri talks about that. It's like, it's the completion of what pure oppression is when the person you're oppressing sees themselves the way that the oppressor sees them utterly, so that the oppressor can step back and their work is done. And at times I've seen that in my own family members in Puerto Rico. And for me, that's colonization, when you utterly cannot believe in your own ability to lead and rule yourself and your people.
Wow. And so you were referencing the book. Go ahead, Randy.
Well, I was just going to say quickly, colonizers love to spot people who excel at self-hatred that way and then tokenize them to speak for all people from that group, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Shut up. That thing ain't broken. And so the book that Orlando was referencing was The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which is a recommendation for everybody to read. So let's talk about, let's get into a little bit of COVID, and then I want to talk to imagination of loving ourselves. COVID has done a number on all of our communities, right? Just we can look at us, and we've been ravaged by this evil disease that is just taking over. 40% of the people dead that have died have been Black. We know that in terms of Margaret, in your community, the president has called it the China virus, the Wuhan virus, Kung flu, and it's led to oppressive, both verbal, psychological, and physical among Asian people across the board, not people who are allegedly Chinese, but just Asian, brown, and it's ravaging the Native community and the brown community as well because of our pre-existing conditions. So help me to understand, since we're in an abnormal time, what is it that you think coming out of the pandemic that you want to do differently when you think about reaching your people group? When you think about your imagination and the idea of loving Native people, loving Latinos, loving Asian, loving Black people, what do you think that you need to do differently now instead of going back to what the old normal was for you?
Yeah. Can I say something real quick?
Go ahead.
Before we jump out, I want to jump back in for a second and make sure that people understand the reason Black, Indigenous people of color were affected so greatly was not an accident. It was intentional.
Go ahead.
Okay. It didn't start out that way, but one of the great reasons why everything was so convoluted and obscured was because it was doing the job that white supremacists loved. So,
and that was doing what is done historically through smallpox, through syphilis, and historically in this nation, it was destroying the lives of a growing population of non-white people in this country. Is that what you want to tell me, Randy Woodley?
That's it, exactly.
Okay. All right. So go ahead, Orlando. Jump in.
I do want to affirm something Randy just said, because I do recall that once it came out in the news that it was Black and Latino folk, right, of color who were dying at higher rates, that's when you started having white populations coming out in en masse to different events, different gatherings. And I just thought it was peculiar, the timing of that. It was almost like, well, it's safe for us. We can go out there because it's not affecting us as much as it's affecting
Them.
those that we don't necessarily care for.
Hmm.
Anybody else want to jump in on the COVID idea?
Yeah,
Margaret, go ahead, Shanay.
I'm sorry, Margaret.
Oh, you're okay.
When I was in seminary, I studied. My favorite stuff was pastoral care. So the way that this affected us spiritually and emotionally was the thing that was so profound to me. The fact that it's a privilege to grieve, it is a privilege to be in lament, even, was so profound. In New York City, you can come outside in any block on Manhattan and see coroner vans, 17 bodies to a freezer in coroner vans because there were no more beds. Your kids asking you, do you think my grandmother's in there? You think they could? This is real talk on the street in New York City. And so then it's so sad about them dying, about the disproportionate rates. But even when it comes to the privilege to grieve, to lament, my counselor says that grief is how you are able to assess your priorities and what's important to you. So even in that moment, when people want to begin to assess what's important to them through grief, through lamenting, through going through the memories, there's all this other red tape. There's all this other spiritual and emotional abusive behavior going on with, we don't have access to the healthcare that we needed. We didn't have access to the life insurance policies that we needed. Policies lapsed right before people died because people were living paycheck to paycheck. So I know a grandmother paying the life insurance 47 years. She missed it the 1 month because she was out of work because she got COVID, and then they didn't cover her. So stuff like that, the privilege to grief even, is usually rushed in Black and brown spaces because we're so disenfranchised in other we're running all over the place, trying to do a GoFundMe, trying to do this, trying to do that, and then the privilege to grieve is even snatched from you. So mentally, I've seen people literally deteriorate because grief is a natural and necessary process. So the families that were Black that had to, and not all Black people, but in my experience here in the Bronx, I've seen kids not drop a tear yet because it was on their back to plan the family funeral. Because maybe they were the only person that spoke English, or they were the only one who know where grandma papers was at. The privilege to grieve was completely taken away because right on the backs of that, we went through a double pandemic with George Floyd, with Breonna Taylor, with Ahmaud Arbery. And so my eyes are just so, we don't even grieve like we should. And that right there was the thing that was destructive, and I also believe intentional.
Wow. That takes a moment to just suck in all of this pain that we've been living with. Go ahead, Margaret.
I think, Reverend Scott, I love this conversation because what you just said just hit me so much that for me, it's even like what you were saying about lamenting, and all that is privilege. And so what's in the social media, like when I think about our Asian American community, they're hearing a lot of justice, they're awakened to even more racial injustices. But what they hear is so much of that, and the language, okay, and we love allies, right? We love our white allies, right? But the language of lament and privilege, the way it's talked about, is that picture of what you're saying is like, you can talk about that and it is important. Mm-hmm. But the reality is, I don't even have the luxury to do that.
Yes.
Right? Yes. And that is an emotional and spiritual and psychological reality that we shoulder. And that's why we're so tired, I think. Mm-hmm. And I heard this thing, I can't remember, I wish I knew, I saw this on Twitter, and it was an African-American pastor who says, your justice, and he's talking about allies, like, your justice actually doesn't help my African-American community that I pastor. Mm-hmm. And I was like, what? It just threw me the way we talk about certain aspects of this, but it comes from a very different lens, and it's not telling some of the other story that you're sharing, right? The rest of the story about lament. Because in Christian circles, sometimes we hear about lament, we hear about, you know what I mean? But the way we talk about it is from a lens of, yeah, we have to do this, and I feel this, and it's true, but not looking at the lens of those who cannot, who can't afford to. And so I just thank you for just your wisdom and your input. That kind of reminds me of the complexity of this COVID situation is bringing a lot of things in our communities, I think.
So as I listen to you guys, all right, so let's get a couple of things on the table. Except for you, Randy, you get almost a pass because you don't deal in the organization milieu that Young Life and Crew and InterVarsity, or even in Impact. So let's talk about, what does ministry look like in our community going forward? Is it just, help me understand it, is it just to have a conversation with somebody, to talk to them about sin, invite them to know Jesus so they can have a relationship with God and go to heaven? Tell me, what's your imagination now of what's really needed when we're going to disseminate this good news to our community? We just lost Randy for a little bit. I think his camera went away. So I must go back to you now, Orlando. We haven't heard you for a second.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
then we'll jump back to Randy if he comes back.
Yeah. One Latino theology that's being resurrected is by Robert Cho Romero, called the Brown Church. And he goes back to some theology that was really kind of brought out through the IFES movement with people like Rene Padilla, Samuel Escobar, who've written about this theme, this theology of misión integral, which is about holding in tension the fact that we're to proclaim the gospel, but that also there should be deeds or actions of love and grace and empowerment that can't be separated from each other. And we've another way to put it is like a truncated gospel, right? How do we shut down parts of the gospel? And so the idea is that with misión integral, you don't shut down any part of the gospel, but it all kind of works in tandem. And I think it's what young people need nowadays. I was talking to one of my nieces who was just so disappointed, so disillusioned with her Christian upbringing. My sister who raised her is Christian, and she's just so disheartened with the church. She feels betrayed by the church. And I think it's because, she's been preached about what it means to be a good Christian, a good follower of Christ. But the praxis, the deeds done are not there. In fact, the deeds done almost contradict or undermine the very gospel that's been proclaimed to her all her life. And so I think that's something that we need to go back to. How do we live out a holistic gospel that speaks to the power of the resurrection of Christ in people's lives? And so instead of separating social justice and the gospel and saying, oh, they're different, or preach the gospel because that's more important. Well, how are you going to preach the gospel to people when you've undermined the very gospel of love to them in your social inaction? And so that's why it becomes hypocritical, and they're exactly right. Non-Christians who believe we're hypocritical, because it's a hypocritical gospel we're preaching and then not living out. And so it's not one or the other. It's a misión integral together. And I think that's part of what I think we want to preach to our Latino students and all of our students with InterVarsity.
Wow. Go ahead, Randy. Jump on and help us flesh out this whole idea of this truncated gospel, which white evangelicals are afraid of. They get insulted when we say their gospel is truncated. When we say, yeah, it's truncated because it's not touching on the aspects of my life to keep me alive, because you're concerned about the hell after I die. And most of us are concerned about the hell we're living in right now. So help me to understand this right now, Randy. Give us some more ad lib to this.
All right. First thing, I want to shout out to Samuel Escobar, who was my mission professor. So thank you for mentioning him. I feel very fortunate to have been able to sit under him for a while. I have trouble with this idea of a truncated gospel or a partial gospel, because if it's not what Jesus taught and lived, it is not the gospel.
Shut up.
So what we're preaching is a false gospel when we are only worried about people's souls, right? So this is not what Jesus was about, a shalom kingdom that was based in an ancient Israel practice and laws and prophets turning people back, and a way of understanding, how to keep their world in a just and merciful and balanced and harmonious way. Jesus was about a shalom kingdom. That shalom kingdom is very non-Western, because in the West, what we did is we separated the intellectual or the ethereal from the physical, right? And so now it's like, even though we say, well, faith without works is dead, most people have a whole lot of quote unquote faith, but they don't have a whole lot of works, right? And so there is no such thing. And this is that exact thing that Orlando was talking about, to separate these things through Platonic dualism, through extrinsic categorization, through hierarchies, through all of these individualism and all the ways that are contrary to the gospel, then it is not the gospel. So the Western worldview is contrary to the gospel that Jesus lived and taught. And so this is why I say we got to get in our heads. We got to get the colonizing out of our heads before we can be able to get the colonizer off our backs, because it's here. We're doing it to ourselves every day. And this is Western Christianity, white normalized European Christianity, adopted this wholesale. So the best thing that we can do is begin to theologize as indigenous people, as Latinx people, as African-American people, as Asian people and Haitian people, and, Southeast Asian people and whatever else. We have to begin to say, look, we were sold a bill of goods about Jesus. Now we know there's a realness. We know the relationship is real, but we have to get that Western way out of our head. The Bible is 90% story, 90% story. And if you understand story from a Western perspective, guess what? You don't understand the Bible, because the West are the least qualified people to interpret story. They think story means, is it true or not? Right?
Exactly.
That's not why it was written. That's not why it was written. And so if you're conservative, you try to prove it's true. And if you're liberal, you try to prove it's not true. And none of that is what the writers intended when they wrote it. And so we've got to have a whole new relationship with Scripture than we've had in the past.
Now, see, before I go further, because I'm coming at you next, Margaret, and I'm going to talk to you about an author something I want you to introduce, because I think this is spot on. But I want to tell our audience, if y'all haven't figured out yet, this is the time to ask questions. So you need to go to Facebook Live for the Impact Movement and write a question, or YouTube, and to ask these panelists some things that I don't see why you wouldn't have a question, because they're stirring up a lot of curiosity out of me. So if you have a question, point them there. In a few minutes, once we get them, we're going to ask them. So let's add a little bit more lib to this and go to you, Margaret Yu. You and I have been talking over the last, 2-3 weeks. And even though I have not used this term, you introduced it, but I've been introducing the idea of trauma, the idea of decolonizing thought within the impact movement. And then why don't you introduce this word, and hopefully no one's going to steal it from you. And we got to record it that Margaret got a patent on it. So go ahead.
No, it's not true. Actually, I've been thinking about what Randy was saying, and so much of my spirituality, I didn't grow up in a Christian home, so I was, in a sense, brought up through the Chinese American church, which is influenced a lot. I'm grateful for that. Influenced a lot by the Western, like different Protestant churches. That's very Western. But also, I was influenced by my organization that I work with, Crew, and I'm grateful for that. But as I kind of think through discipleship, as I think through how do we grow, I think about in what you were saying, Randy. It's the Western theology is very much like you believe and therefore you act, right? A lot of what we call orthodoxy and orthopraxy. And that's actually good, because we do want, like what we're talking about, like we want our faith to be about words and truth and doctrine, but we also want our actions to be action of gospel of love, that we love our neighbors. But as I think about it, I think in the West, so much of Christianity is about we teach people beliefs, orthodoxy, so we hope that they'll change their action. But what I think we're missing, and when I listen to even young people nowadays who are for justice, a lot of it is that, or even people who are struggling with what are we doing? You know, Christians who are struggling with what's happening in America, they cannot wrap their arms around it, and they don't have empathy towards those who are hurting, towards people who are image bearers, you know. And so I think about it, and I think what's missing in the Western church is this thought of orthopathy, which is that in our discipleship, not only do we teach about the doctrine and the good word of the gospel of God and the word of God, but we also teach orthopraxy. How do we love our neighbors? How do we love ourselves? But what's missing to me a lot is this idea of aligning our hearts. And I think in our communities, we kind of do that. Maybe we just do it naturally, aligning our hearts to the desires of God. But even that, when I align myself to the desires of God, I learn how to love my neighbor. I learned that maybe right now, I don't know how to love my neighbor who's very different from me. But God, will you align my heart and change my heart and my emotions? Help me to align myself to your desires for people and even experience. I think a lot of the church, like sometimes when I talk to people and I share with them my experience, and like what Randy was saying, they would just say, but that's not it. They'll minimize it because they're not looking at my discipleship as my experience. But really, it's a package with orthodoxy and orthopraxy. It's all those in teaching our people the desires of God, the heart of God, and how God sees all that we are as belonging and experience. And really teaching the church that is important. And I think about people who are racist. I think you can teach them things about doctrine, but they don't change. But I wonder if we need to focus on teaching them about the heart of God even more. But again, the system is messed up. But even when I think about the church, I think even if our communities grow, you know, and it can grow in the midst of a system that's not designed for us, it's not ideal. But even if our systems grow, our communities grow, the church at large that's predominantly white has to learn a different way of discipleship. And I think the way we're doing discipleship right now is you think, therefore you'll change your actions. I think we need to teach people the heart of God and orthopathy and to really look at that. Maybe that would help us. I think in our communities, we value our experiences. We practice orthopraxy and orthodoxy. And I think we practice our experiences as important in learning the heart of God, connecting the heart of God with our communities. So,
you know, as I listen to you, Margaret, I keep thinking about slave spirituals. And I think that's exactly what the slave was talking about, the slave master. Everybody talking about heaven ain't always getting there because they kept talking about heaven, but it was a separation of how they treated us as people. In fact, even dismissing our humanity, raping women, dismembering men, removing children. So removing children from parents is not a new practice in the United States of America. They've been practicing it with all of our communities right here. They've been removing them. They've been taking them out. Even in Canada, what was the term they said out of the children, even in boarding schools, Randy, is the idea, can we move the Indian out of the person? So it was this whole phenomenon.
Kill the Indian, save
That's right.
the child.
Kill the Indian, save the child. So this has been a phenomenon that people think this is just a modern day reality of the current president, when this is just a continuation of what we know from history past. So let's talk a little bit more. Shanay, what do you reimagine then you think needs to happen differently in your ministry of Young Life? Because if you just don't want to just give them a track, have them to believe, say the prayer, and think your job is over.
That's a loaded question. I don't know if anybody from Young Life is on here, but I'm gonna just say it.
I promise you, if you don't get a job at Young Life, we'll figure out something for you at the Impact Movement. But go ahead.
I think the first thing that I recognized immediately was that the way that I'm censored through working like an organization through Young Life was never going to be enough. That I needed to find alternate ways to be able to introduce the kids that I was serving to the gospel that I know would save their life. And I had to be honest about the red tape that was around the type of gospel that I could teach them about. I can't really teach them about an all-loving God, because that excludes this person, that person. I mean, we say that on the site, but we can't really talk about an all-loving God. And we definitely can't talk about a brown Jesus that was hanging out with 12 of his homies that wasn't good enough to be with him in the first place, but he saved their life. Like, we can't talk about that. And so I had to create alternate platforms, to be honest, so that I wouldn't feel like a sellout. Oh, wow. Because I knew the gospel that they are asking me to promote. And I know what I signed and I know what I said. But I've almost created under railroad passages of telling the true story. And then another thing that I think is going to be pivotal, I think about the way we got brainwashed in the first place. Before African slaves were able to read English, they brainwashed us through telling stories to us about what the Bible said, interpreting it to us. And then they brainwashed us through pictures, through stained glass windows that told stories of a white Jesus. And when we didn't see ourselves, we thought that maybe we were created for slavery. And so I think in that same way, art is the way. Because when I let somebody proclaim the gospel through a spoken word or through a hip hop piece or through singing or through dance, and they don't say anything at all, but they're preaching, when I let them preach with their bodies and their art and like all that kind of stuff, that is how I reimagine that we would go into church and really not even have to, it wouldn't be this intellectual experience, that we would be moved internally through the art of it. Because one thing about these kids coming up, they're very artistic. And they're also tired of hearing us talk. They've been sitting in our Sunday school classes since 94. They're also tired of hearing us talk. We've been talking to them, at them, since they've been baptized. And so what does it look like to have one of my kids that's really good at graffiti draw a brown Jesus? What does it look like to put on plays and shows where you could be one of the disciples? Peter probably looked closer to you than he did to Bob, who's wanted to kidnap the story and make you feel like you don't fit. And so one of the things that I've been doing on Instagram Live is this thing called Jesus Juice, where I literally tell the stories that they don't know. I help them to find their brown skin in the context of the gospel. Because there's two things that my kids are for certain: that God don't care about Black people, and that God doesn't care about how they feel. And so that connection between art and mental health, art and spirituality. What do you mean God doesn't care about you, about the way you feel? You mean the same God that sat Elisha from under the sycamore tree and had all this feminine energy and nursed him back to health because he was depressed? That God doesn't care about how we, the thing about lament and all of that is how we reimagine this holistic gospel. My Catholic friends will call it cura personalis, this holistic gospel of like, does God care about how I feel? Does God care about how I look? Does God care about what language I speak? Does God care about representation, that somebody that looks like me is speaking the gospel to me? And is God clever enough to get his word to the bottom of my heart without saying another thing through a person who doesn't mean me any good? Wow. And I think the answer to that is yes. If we would just let them rap, if we would just let them sing, if we would just let them dance, the Holy Spirit is able to meet them. But we've tried to censor their gifts in so many ways and told them that if they couldn't play an organ or preach with a hoop, that it didn't matter. And it does matter, because that's the way we became brainwashed in the first place. We couldn't read. We sat in the back of Gothic temples and looked at that stained glass windows for decades. And said, oh, we don't see ourselves. I guess it's not us. So we were able to indoctrinate people that couldn't even read and make them believe that the gospel didn't include them. Why can't we use art to help to peel back some of that? And when I let my kids rap or sing or dance in a place of worship, and the fact that they don't think that it will be welcome there, we will be liberated. That's what I feel.
So Orlando, she's touching on this stuff again, and I want to talk about the tension that we have. This tension of working, if I can't say, in evangelical spaces, and the tension to reach your people, but also to work through the inner parts of asking yourself, am I compromising who I am, or am I compromising legitimate ways to reach my community in ways that my community would hear it? Is that something that comes up for you in your mind? Is that something that you resonate with, or do you find that is a distance from you? Talk to me a little bit about that. You're on mute. Unmute him. Can we get him?
Okay.
There
Yeah,
you go.
I got it. That usually happens to me at least once during every call. So, no, I was saying, I think intuitively it's probably why I decided to do Latino specific work, because as I started to do, here in New York City, as I started to do LaFe conferences and events, I realized that to be able to present the gospel through the lens of Latino identity, it didn't shrink the gospel, it didn't undermine the gospel, but it brought it to life, because the great commandment is, to love God, to love your neighbor as yourself. And I think what I discovered was that you had many Latino youth who really didn't know how to love themselves, like we were talking about earlier. And so when we unlocked that part of them, they were able to then receive God's love. And so then the gospel made sense for them. And so that's where, for me, ethnic specific ministry is not distancing ourselves from the gospel. It's creating a lens or venue for some of our ethnic students to be able to understand God's love for them. And so I think that's why, for me, just being part of the Latino ministry, I think it's helped me to endure all these years with InterVarsity, because they've given me that root that I needed to be able to do the ministry work that I was sensing God directing, giving me greater direction toward. And so for me too, I think the idea of being part of other ministries other than just InterVarsity has helped me to find some balance as well. At times when I'm feeling frustrated or not understood. And so being part of here, that we have a progressive Latino think tank called Latino Leadership Circle. We do podcasts together. We did 3 podcasts on the election. Those are the kinds of things that I think has helped me as a Latino minister in a predominantly white organization to be able to maintain my balance in reaching my Latino community in my ministry, but also outside of it as well, here in New York and in the Bronx.
All right, so I'm going to ask our audience one more time. Jump in here. If you have a question, go to Facebook Live, the Impact page, post a question. We got people who will share the question to us or to our YouTube channel. After that, Randy, I want to change it for you. I want to ask you this question. I want you to give me a Randy Woodley answer, as I know I can only get it. When some people listen to this and they come to you and they say, Randy, I want you to be a Christian first before being Native or Indigenous. What's your answer to that?
I'm like the Christians that committed genocide against our people. Is that what you want me to be? I don't know. So, just to go back, and this ties in with that, correct beliefs historically have never led to correct action.
Wow.
And so, we think if we get it right, all of a sudden everything's going to be rosy. And this is part of the individualism in America. And it's part of the dualism that we get sucked into thinking that the correct beliefs are what get us on the right path. And well, you know, I think Jesus wasn't so worried about correct beliefs. He was more concerned about what we're doing. He said, follow me 31 times, right? I think he said something about being born again one time. But that is where we get this spiritual doctrine that is no longer, it's our theology that is no longer embodied. It's disembodied theology, right? So you can't be, Jimmy, you can't be a Christian and not be who you are, who God made you to be. So this is the silliest question, really, that you can think of as a very Western question, right? It's like, jump outside now, be a Christian first, you know, and that, again, this is part of the hierarchy that comes with dualism. As soon as you fall into the trap of dualism, Platonic dualism, you have to start ranking everything. So now men have to be over women, you know, white people have to be over Black, Indigenous, people of color. You know, all these hierarchies have to come as a result of that. Jesus was against hierarchy. Jesus said, don't act like the Gentiles. You know, they lord their faith over one another. You know, instead, just serve one another, right? So that's a very non-hierarchical thing. And so it's almost the opposite. It's putting yourself almost below them, right? So this is the opposite. So you can't be a Christian outside of any culture or any race of whatever you are, or any ethnicity of whoever you are. Now, you can, what they're really saying is, you know, can you be a Western Christian in the tradition of the white European West and then think about who you are as a person, which is utterly foolish and utterly impossible. I mean, right now we can all just say, let's think outside of our culture. Let's think about anything outside of our own culture, right? It's impossible because God has planted you where you are, and you can't get outside of it, right? You can't get outside of your own worldview and your own head and everything else, unless, I mean, there is a way to think like other people. Yeah, you can think in other worldviews. It's difficult, but you can do it. But you know, don't try to draw me. That's that metaphysicalness. Don't try to draw me out of my, you know, my quote, my spirit out of my body and say, be a Christian first and not who God made me to be in this body. Crazy.
Well, that's called Gnosticism too, doesn't it? Because you put an emphasis on the spirit and not on the body. Now, it's interesting. It's quite interesting that most of the time I hear this rhetoric, it's not aimed at white people. It's always aimed at oppressed people.
Yes.
Of course.
Right?
It's
because
a tool of assimilation.
It is. And it's deadly. I mean, I looked at this thing from Toni Morrison, and it has riddled my mind since the first time I saw it. It was a documentary that came out by on Toni Morrison, and she tells a story of when she was talking to her girlfriend, who was a teenager, about God. And her girlfriend said, I don't believe in God. And Toni Morrison said, I do, and started a dialogue with her and said, why don't you believe in God? Because God has never answered my prayers. And she said, what have you been praying for? Well, I've been asking God for blue eyes, and he's never answered my prayer. And so Toni Morrison then begins, because her first novel, The Bluest Eye, is off this interaction. And she says that kind of racism is even more deadlier than the shootings or the lynchings or anything else, because it's a living death that is corroding and eating away at her soul while she lives. And quite frankly, if the white evangelical church wasn't paying attention at all right now, they need to pay attention to this fact, that what this pandemic has done is highlighted all of the inequities that has brought death to our community, and they need to realize that that same death is also coming at them. So I haven't said that.
Exactly. And it's not just that we're the canary in the coal mine, it's that they can't live a full life. See, we quoted Paulo Freire a while ago, and he also said that the oppressed and the oppressor have to heal together.
Exactly.
One can't It can't be done without the other. And so, this is to the advantage of everyone, not just people of color, right? So, and if you think about homogeneity is death. I mean,
Exactly.
it is what we like to call it order, but what it really is control, right? It's only when things are a little chaotic that they're actually in God's order. It's only when things seem like that we don't have a handle on it or control on it, then I think God is happy about that because we're not in control.
So let me ask you this. Saturday night, President-elect Biden, I don't mind saying that since some people have trouble saying that just yet in our government. President-elect Biden talked about unifying us. He says we're a divided nation. Some commentaries said, well, we've always been a divided nation. Let me ask you a question, Margaret. What's easier, to heal a divided nation or to heal the Christian community? Which one is more difficult to heal?
Oh my gosh. I don't know if I can answer that. I don't really know how to answer that, honestly. I think that the healing for this country is so ensconced in this system. And I think the way we are right now in our society is not only is our government and our world in the United States very divided, polarized, but even in the Christian faith, like in Christian community, we are so divided. And we see it even in our ministries, like Asian American communities are made up of many groups. And so even in our Christian community, we do see some differences. And so I think it's doubly hard in our faith because politics does come into play, right? Because it affects all our communities. And so I actually think that they're both really just as bad. They augment each other. They don't, the way I think evangelicalism has really been aligned with the politics and the narrative of protecting our religion is not helping us, right? And so there's a lot of fear that goes with it. And so we've got to really examine our hearts, the orthopathy, but also our doctrine of what Jesus says and who he is and our practice. Because I think that the way we're looking at things as the church has so much history from like 1920s, and I look at the Asian American Evangelical Church, it's about 50 years old, right? But it's forgotten the other parts of our faith, which went beyond, right? And so I think for my community is reclaiming that, but reclaiming it in such a way as ministers of the gospel in such a way that we're faithful to the gospel and social action, right? But teaching that the church could be both, but our people are so ensconced, including myself, okay? And what I've had to learn about my faith is so ensconced in Western theology, but also evangelical tendencies to really look at politicking as fighting for religious rights or fighting for my socioeconomic class and what we want, rather than looking at what God says, right? And really, or even fighting for just certain parts of what we believe as, being giving dignity of life to others. I think we've got to re-examine our relationship with politics and how we look at it maybe more as how do we serve this country rather than partisan stuff. You know what I mean? I just feel like we have gone a lot in working our fear that's creeping into our politics and our evangelicalism.
Well, I mean, it's no doubt that in the country, identity politics is what's been driving the last 4 or maybe 12 years, because we got a shrinking population of white people. And then many of the people who are evangelical have been white people who have been afraid of the same thing. We do have a question, so let's get this question out on the board if we can. And here we go. David Yang has asked his question. How do you best explain the connection between a name like China virus and increasing anti-Asian violence, especially in response to those who say the words used to describe COVID aren't important, or are saying, well, the virus did come from China. Is that the end of the question? I think so. Yes. All right. So y'all want to, well, Margaret, you represent the community from David Yang, but others can chime in. How do you best explain the connection between a name like China virus and increasing anti-Asian violence?
I just want to mention a historical fact real quick, and that is that Chinese has always been used as a way to say Asian people, right? So the Anti-Chinese Immigration Act was not just levied against Chinese people; it was levied against all Asian people, because in a way, you know, when white America at that time, especially here in the West, looked at Asian folks, they just said Chinese, right? And it didn't matter, you know, they didn't understand, or they didn't want to understand the difference between Asian folks. So when we talk about Chinese, there's a historic prejudice in this country against all Asian people. And I just want to make that note of history.
Oh, that's good. That is very good. Go ahead, Margaret. You want to answer the question?
I think that when people use, you know, it's the reality of scapegoating and what people do all the time, and they scapegoat to provoke fear, and they scapegoat to blame people, and we've got to understand that's where a lot of xenophobic and racist acts come from, and we've got to figure out to say that words matter, you know, and that what we say does hurt and does harm and provoke racism. Like, there was a survey recently, and I think it's more than that, like 1 out of 4 Asian American youth and young adults have experienced anti-Asian racism since COVID. And so it does matter what you say. And if you blame it, people, it leads to other actions of violence. And we all know that in our communities. And so it's really important that we reclaim and say, no, that's not what, you know, the World Health Organization would say. And we need to correct that, because it matters to our community. You know, sometimes it's violence and death, and it also promotes the same thing, that we keep on perpetuating blame and fear and scapegoating communities of color.
Anybody else want to join in on those commentary about the China virus or the Wuhan virus and anti?
I just think, like, not about that specifically, but America has the biggest self-reflection issue. I mean, even the way that we talk about welfare and food stamps, and how we have perpetuated the narrative of who's on that and who takes advantage of that, how we have perpetuated the mammy and the welfare queen, how we just have created all of these pictures so that people could think that Black boys in hoodies with Skittles were criminals, and that Chinese people bought the coronavirus here. We just need a prototype, because we're going to do everything besides self-reflect. You know, we just need somebody to represent all the sin that we can't handle about ourselves. And even when it comes to being an African-American woman, they will literally kidnap you, ask you to build this country, breed you, and then blame you for not being American. Like, that's just in the fabric of, like, this country. We've seen it with Ebola. We've seen it with the swine flu. Those diseases were all attached to people groups that were not American. And so it should not be surprising when something starts to happen domestically. We have domestic control over it, but we blame it on international things. And when you have, and I don't know if we can say this, when you have a former president who is toxically optimist, that it's okay, and wants to give us this false hope, then you just blame it on China as if 250,000 Americans died. Like anybody cares about that. I just, another thing that I have to say, I was a little girl when 9/11 happened. I was in a 4th grade. I'm really probably making y'all feel old, but I was in the 4th grade when 9/11
I ain't feeling old, because I was 2 when that happened, but go ahead.
I remember going to school in a predominantly African American and Indian community. We had plenty of friends with kids who were Indian. As soon as 9/11 happened, children were able to not want to be friends, not want to talk anymore. All of a sudden, your turban meant you were criminal or a terror. And I remember being on the playground just feeling so confused about what this means now. So if that's already happening in people, when something tragically like that happens to our country, when you have the leader of the free world perpetuating that from up front, it only sits on top of the fear that people already feel about how we handle this in our interpersonal relationships. And I think we will if we start to say, you know what, we were wrong in one area, we would have to pull the scabs off what we did to Native Americans, what we did to Africans, what we did. Like, we would just have to pull all the scabs off. And I don't know if we're ever going to do that. And so every time something happens, we will find a person, we will find a prototype,
Yes.
gay,
To blame.
transgenders,
Yes.
we will find somebody to scapegoat.
But the problem I'm struggling with is the juxtaposition that whenever I can tell my wife always when someone white is a culprit, because there'll be no pictures and there'll be no articulation about who they are. So you can get our former president coming down the escalator talking about Mexico is not giving us their best people, they're rapists. Yet his best friend, Jeff Epstein, has a whole island for child sex slavery. And yet that doesn't come up at all. The juxtaposition of such tragic parody. And then people don't even see it. And then they still cling to him because of that. But the thing about it is, he's not an enigma or just an isolated. That's the way the narrative has always been played out against us. And I think the problem, what we need to do, and that's why, Randy, I'm glad you're writing. I got one of his books, his latest one, Decolonizing Evangelicalism, but he's got a couple of other ones. Name a couple of them so we can get them on our site, Randy.
So, Shalom in the Community of Creation and Indigenous Vision is probably one that most people are ready for now. If you're very evangelical, then you should probably first read Living in Color, Embracing God's Passion for Ethnic Diversity, because I have Bible all through the thing, right? But our latest one, Decolonizing Evangelicalism, really has to do with not just evangelicalism, although that's a specific concern, but Christianity in general in America. So,
and so what we need to do, and this is what W.B. Du Bois did when the NAACP started. He was one of the founders, and he had the opportunity to be the executive director. Instead, he decided to be the publisher and editor-in-chief of the Crisis magazine, because he realized the fight for the well-being of our community was in our heads. And he needed new propaganda to compete with the messages that this society was saying about us, which tells us we're competing with all the images that are done through TV, all the images that we hear through radio, and all the social media. In fact, it's so good now that what they did to the slaves in the 1800s, we're repeating it right now in the 21st century. And so what they did, it used to be white people who would communicate propaganda about who we were, and then they turned it over to black people to preach that propaganda in their absence. And so now you got people who represent our different community representing poison to our community without the need of white people, because the colonization is in their head and is coming out of their mouths, and is even coming out, in some cases, Shanay, some of their artwork, so that the death is affecting us. And so what we need to do, we need a revitalization. We need a rejuvenation. We need something to change the way that we hope to do our message of hope, because the way we getting it from our white evangelical brothers is just not enough to do service in our world. It's not. Now we're almost out of time. It's not 15. I don't know if there's another question, but I do have this last question for you guys. What gives you hope going forward in your ministry to your various communities? Let me start with Randy.
So actually, millennials give me hope. Not just white millennials, but millennials of color, because they have, as a I mean, they have their issues too, right? But what they have said is that we do not want our parents' paradigm. We don't want what you handed down to us. We don't want to be homophobic. We don't want to be prejudiced. We don't want to be racist. We don't want low education. We don't. They have basically made their mark, and they're willing to go out on the streets about it, right? And so, yeah, it's kind of like it's a little bit out of control, which is fine with me, right? Because that's how you actually get things done, and sooner or later it kind of settles down. But to me, I teach them constantly. I have conferences where I'm at, and right now I'm by Zoom. But their questions and their eagerness to learn and their commitment to actually do something about it is giving me hope like I've never had before. I didn't even think I would live to see this day. I lived through the 60s, right? I remember when King was shot. I remember, all of those. I remember Vietnam. I remember all of the protests. I remember being at some, and as a young person. And so I thought, the world is changing for better. And then it didn't, right? Mm-hmm. But right now, these young people, when you go out and you see Black Lives Matter, half of these people are white and most of them are younger. And hey, I'm ready for this day.
What about you, Margaret? What gives you hope? I think what gives me hope is actually this generation of Gen Z, because when I think about students coming up to college, I mentor some junior high kids, and I'm learning a lot from them. But even as I watch this COVID season, like what Randy was saying, the people who are marching and who are protesting are not just African Americans. They're actually white people, but also other people of color. And so I love that. And I think what I love is that there is a sense in this generation, this young generation, that they'll say, of course, Black Lives Matter, right? And I think given that kind of social awareness and empathy is teaching people the heart behind that, not just to do justice work on a shallow base, but really to teach the heart of God about, to follow the God of justice, but also to go, the gospel is important, in terms of who Jesus is, but also how it's lived out in these communities. And so that gives me hope that they get some of the realities of this world, and that we get to teach them and disciple them in the ways of Jesus and what he says and what the gospel is powerful to do. And so that gets me excited about Asian Americans, as well as people of color who are younger, that they bring a lot, that they actually can organize, and not just in terms of protest, but really living it out in every fabric of our society, that they can make a difference.
Shanay, what gives you hope?
I would say 3 things. I think we have a real opportunity at real white allyship. There are some white people that I work with that are millennial, and some white people that I have done ministry to and with that are forever changed, that have changed the trajectory of what they're going to study in school, of who they're going to marry, of what they're going to believe, of how they're going to vote, because they were willing to sit through my Bible study, Exodus through the lens of Tupac, right? Like that really changes like what they think to be true about this world. And then I think I would say how disgruntled my generation is with the church. The mass exodus of like organized church goer, the religiosity of it has completely fallen apart. And we're kind of like in the waiting season to try to figure out, what do we do? The amount of us that still tithe, want to baptize our babies, like we want to do the things that we felt like were good, but there's this disgruntled, this complaining, this holy anger about what we felt like the church robbed us from. And I think we're complaining so much we might be on the brink of a movement. And then I would say it feels like a really good time to be Black, young, and a woman. And I don't know if I've ever felt good about that. And not the kind of not the kind of woman that is trying to assimilate, but that has deep convictions about, is there room at this table for other people, other women, other people of color. I see that when I go into boardrooms. And then I know a lot of people in my generation are really upset at baby boomers, are really upset at older people, but there are some older people that are handing the baton over. Who are saying that you are welcome into this conversation. And so I appreciate all those spaces where me and people like me have been included. And you guys have more ministry experience than I've been alive. And so I'm grateful. I'm grateful for that.
Wow, that's really cool. Now, I'm not going to do any sex change, so I'm happy about Black women feeling good about being Black women. I want to tell you that. I was listening to Congressman Nikema Williams today. So excited. She's AKA, and she's in love with the idea of Kamala. And people, when she first started her political career, they said, you should change your name to Nikki. And she said, no, I'm not. I'm going to let people struggle with my name. And because Kamala continues, and they've been butchering her names, and I've been practicing to make sure I said it right. I'm excited about this woman's name and her identity. All right, all right, Orlando, close it out. Give me some hope.
Yeah, so for me, I think similar to what you just mentioned, it's Latina women who give me hope. When I stepped into the role as LaFed director in 2000, my board was primarily, it was like 75% Latina women, people like Sandra Van Amstel, who's doing some great justice work right now. Jen Huerta Ball, she died a few years ago, but was a prolific speaker and a varsity, phenomenal leader. Also, Joanna Acevedo here in New York City, associate regional director, just these outspoken, powerful women. And so I was just privileged to work with them. And I'm seeing a new crop of Latina women, people like Noemi Vega, Elizabeth Barrera, Victoria Mejia, Natalia Cohn. These are women who have been empowered, I think, through university and through Lafayette to lead, and they're leading in phenomenal ways. And when I think about the Latino church, we've been often, so many of our churches survive only because we have Latina women who make those churches function well. I mean, I remember my sister, when she started going to church in Chicopee, Massachusetts, the pastor there was a Latina woman who took over because the pastor failed miserably, had some financial impropriety. She stepped in interim to kind of wait for the next pastor to come, and did such a phenomenal job that it was without a doubt that she was supposed to be the next pastor, and everybody understood it. Even in a church that was Pentecostal, that didn't believe in women in ministry, but she proved herself so phenomenally that that they knew God was calling her to lead the church. And so I'm just seeing that, you know, Latina women stepping up, leading, writing books, doing phenomenal work, and I'm just happy to be working with them, and they give me hope.
Wow. I need to say a couple more things about our guests. So Orlando Crespo has a book called Latino in Christ. It's by R.S.V.P.
Being Latino in Christ. Yeah.
Being Latino in Christ. I want you to look it up on Amazon, or you can go directly to University Press. Randy has already told you his books. Shanay's book is not out yet, but I want y'all to pay attention. Give me 2 years, and Shanay's going to have her a book out. Is that right, Shanay? You got one?
I got a workbook. I do. Look, guys.
Oh, there it is. Give me the title.
It is called Reconstructing Sisters, Visions, and Purposes. And so it is a student workbook, and it is a facilitator's guide to guide young girls of color through self-esteem, boundaries, and issues around colorism. And so I was a teacher in the Philadelphia school district for at-risk girls, and there was just no material for them. So we created books for girls of color to navigate their self-esteem well. So if you want to do that with a group of young girls that you know, you can find it on Amazon.
Excellent. So we can find that on Amazon. Look up Shanay Scott. We're going to put it on our Facebook page. And Margaret Yu has a book coming out on orthopathy, orthopraxy, and orthodoxy, how they all work together, I promise you. And I want to thank all of these phenomenal people I've met over the years, because
Mm.
my hope is in them. And one of the things I said to Margaret, one of my first conversations, is that white supremacy's biggest problem is because our communities don't build coalition. And I'm convinced one of the ways to dismantle white supremacy is the strength of partnership between Latino or Latinx, Asian, Native, and BIPOC people. All together, we got to work together. And we've got to fight to stay alive. I believe that. And that's what my hope is. And so I'm committed until I die to continue in this coalition. And I want to thank everybody who joined us tonight. These are some powerful people. They all could have spoke by themselves, and unfortunately, I brought them all together for us to listen to all four of their narratives together. But I want to say thank you. So afterwards, after you see our credits, if you want to give to the Impact Movement during this COVID session, please, we take it. You'll see a QR code, or you can do text to give at a particular number when this is over. So thank you very much, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.